I've never been good at providing abstracts. My best bet is to provide a very abstract. And in fact, I've been providing abstracts all along, which means that I allow whatever I'm talking about to sort of flow in its own dynamic. And that's what I'm going to be doing here.
Hello, wherever you are. Rhiannon Crane here. Welcome to the first of our Semantrix dialogue sessions, which is basically where psychedelic experts bring a topic to our little group and then riff on that topic, usually in relation to language, consciousness, culture, art, and whatever else. So we had an intense and illuminating start to the series with Dr. William Rowlandson walking us through the convoluted origins and history of the word sustainable or sustainability, you know, the binds and paradoxes of our present social and environmental predicament. Now, we're actually sharing this session pretty much uncut, partly due to technical issues on my end, and partly because, despite being chronological, William took us on a fairly non-linear tour, we'll see. So, Dr. William Rowlandson is a senior lecturer at the University of Kent in Canterbury. He's the author of books and articles on a great many things, including Latin American and Cuban cultural and political history. He's written on Borges, Swedenborg, mysticism, psychedelics, the imaginal, fairy, the daimonic, and many more things. He's an encyclopedia of mystical knowledge. Also the co-founder of Canterbury Climate Action Partnership and founding member of the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred. He's an allotment holder, a gardener, a composter, a vermophile, mycophile, rewild, a proud tree hugger, drummer with Whitstable, Samba Pelomar, megalithomaniac and a weirdonaut, and also the father of 2 female entities. And William is also a great meaning maker. We've known each other for some years now, and he's probably the most useful person in any sort of crisis. He's a master at finding the mythic meaning in the everyday chaos of modern life. So we hope you enjoy the session. If anyone has any topics that they'd like to propose, then don't hesitate to get in touch. The email is semantrix.sessions@gmail.com. It's in the show notes. Also, if anyone would like to come and join the live group where we record these, we're a small and friendly rabble, and we usually meet on Tuesday evenings at 7:30 UK time on the internet. So without further ado, we give you William Rowlandson.
Now, what does this all come down to? It comes down to the fact that you guys have set up this whole series called Semantrix based upon the idea of taking a word and wrestling with it. And there is nothing I enjoy more than wrestling with a word. And I have a particular, an ally in my wrestling with words, but I don't have it with me in front of me, so I can't hold it up for the camera. It is the compact Oxford English Dictionary published in 1971, which was it's so small. I don't know if any of you here knows this dictionary, but if you ever manage to get yourselves a copy of it, hang on to it like it's the most treasured and valuable possession. It is in 2 volumes and it's huge. It's absolutely enormous. And it weighs, my goodness, it probably weighs about 4 stone it weighs. It's in 2 volumes and it comes with a little drawer in the top. And in the little drawer, what is in the little drawer? Who knows? What's in the little drawer at the top?
Magnifying glass?
It is. It's a magnifying glass. It's a beautiful magnifying glass. It's a kind of one of those lovely 1960s and 70s kind of heavy, chunky, black sort of Bakelite, and it's made by Bausch and Lomb, who have been making all sorts of heavy plastic things for a long time. And what I find beautiful about this is that Ursula K. Le Guin, whom I consider to be one of the most phenomenal people of all time, and for those of you who are not familiar with Ursula K. Le Guin, today is the day that you can become familiar with Ursula K. Le Guin. Everyone should know Ursula K. Le Guin. And I'm going to read you guys something. I'm going to read you guys something from Ursula K. Le Guin. Oh, I've got it here. I've got it here. No, I don't. I've got it. Sorry. I'm going to read you something. I'll just quickly get the... I've got it in front of me here. So this is from the introduction of the Book of Fantasy by Jorge Luis Borges and Silvina Ocampo and Adolfo Bioy Casares, all three of whom are extraordinary people. Silvina Ocampo and Adolfo Bioy Casares were married, and they were both friends with Borges. And they published this book called El Libro de la Fantasía, the Book of Fantasy. And in 1988, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote the introduction to a re-edition of this book. And she writes, and I'm going to read this. I love this. I absolutely adore this. I think Ursula K. Le Guin is just such a wonderful person. So here goes the quote. There are two books, she writes, which I look upon as esteemed and cherished great aunts or grandmothers, wise and mild, though sometimes rather dark of counsel, to be turned to when the judgment hesitates for want of material to form itself upon. One of these books provides facts of a peculiar sort, the other does not. The I Ching, or Book of Changes, is the visionary elder who has outlived fact, the ancestor with a capital A. So she's so old she speaks a different tongue. Her counsel is sometimes appallingly clear, sometimes very obscure indeed. The little fox crossing the river wets its tail, she says, smiling faintly, or a dragon appears in the field, or biting upon dried gristly meat. One retires to ponder long upon such advice. The other auntie is younger and speaks English. Indeed, she speaks more English than anybody else. She offers fewer dragons and much more dried grisly meat. And yet, the Oxford English Dictionary, or a new English dictionary on historical principles, is also a book of changes. Most wonderful in its transmutations. It is not a book of sand, yet it is inexhaustible. Not an aleph, yet all we can ever say is there if we can but find it. Yet all we can ever say is there if we can but find it. Auntie, I say, magnifying glass in hand, because my edition, the compact auntie, is compressed into 2 volumes of terrifyingly small print. Auntie, please tell me about fantasy, because I want to talk about the Book of Fantasy, but I'm not sure what I'm talking about. And then she continues to, that's brilliant. That was Ursula K. Le Guin, 1988, in her introduction to Borges, Bioy Casares and Silvia Ocampo's Book of Fantasy. I also have the same compact auntie that Ursula K. Le Guin has, and of the same year as well, 1971, with the same magnifying glass. And of course, what I've done many times, hundreds of times, and this is fitting for talking in a group around Semantrix, is I've called out, Auntie, please tell me about, and I choose a word. And in this case, the word I'm asking for is Auntie, please tell me about sustainability. So I turn the pages. First of all, I have to choose the right volume, because A to L and then L to Z. So I pull out the second volume. It weighs a ton, even half of it weighs a ton. I get out my magnifying glass, turn the pages, turn the pages, turn the pages, turn the pages, really thin pages in 2 columns. Each column, it basically has 4 pages in each page. That's how small it is. It's just unbelievable. Turn the pages, turn the pages, turn the pages, turn the pages. And I look through it and I find sustain, sustainable, sustained, sustainer, sustaining, sustainingly, sustainment, sustainable. And that's curious because it's quite brief and it only has a couple of quotes. You know how the Oxford English Dictionary has all these quotes from literature, and I can tell you a wonderful story about that, but I'll pause for a minute. It has a little quote, and it's curious enough from Thomas de Quincey, which I find quite interesting. But what I found interesting is 1971, sustainability is not there. And the way I look at it is if a word does not appear in a dictionary of this Borgesian infinitude, then it doesn't exist. Or at least it didn't exist at the time of publication, obviously. It cannot have existed, because if it does exist, it would be there. And sure enough, there are even words there in that dictionary that don't even exist, but they do only exist in the dictionary. Just have a go. You will find some extraordinary words in there. So the fact that sustainability doesn't exist in 1971, to me, is really interesting, because this is an indication that it's a modern word with a modern set of meanings and a whole, as it were, a modern phenomenon. What is sustainability? Well, I guess the first thing we did to do is say, okay, what does it mean? The concept always predates the idea. Well, I say that, but in general, a concept predates an idea. So sustainability goes back a long, long way. And I teach this, so it's not that recent. Rianne, you just said my recent explorations, but actually this goes back a long time. Since 2018, I've been teaching a module here at the university on sustainability, approached from the position of arts and humanities. And so I do spend a lot of time talking about sustainability, and I do so with a particular mission beyond anything else, and that is so that everyone can pull it apart when they see it, because it is used everywhere. But let's pause on for a while. But sustainability, its history. One of my colleagues who teaches on the module with me, who works in the Department of German here in Modern Languages, he goes back looking at sustainability. And it's really interesting to see how it was coined. At least the idea sort of goes all the way back to the basic idea of management resources. And in fact, there's a word that's used in German, which I can't pronounce, or at least I really struggle to pronounce, and it's Nachhaltigkeit. There you are. Nachhaltigkeit. Look, I'm going to put it in the chat, and if anyone can pronounce it for me, then please sing out, because I'm not a German speaker. The most I can come up with is hospital. Sasha, say it again, mate. I missed that.
Nachhaltigkeit.
Are you underwater, Sasha?
No, but this is my old computer. So
okay, well,
sometimes says like that. Nachhaltigkeit, yeah.
Nachhaltigkeit. Well, thank you, Sasha. You've that's. I could have done it myself, of course. No, don't worry. I'm not a German speaker, but yes, this word appears in a fellow who was manager of the King's Forest in Germany in the 1600s. His name was von Karlowitz. And this is a very simple position. And I like this, and I like this a lot. And that is, if you remove more timber from the forest than can be regrown, then the forest will be depleted. Such would not be sustainable. So therefore, if you're going to be using the forest for timber, you obviously have to ensure that you don't remove from the forest more timber than can be regrown. It's a really simple, basic situation that, if you think about it, humans must have been observing since the dawn of history. And sure enough, when we look at, I'm sure many of you have looked at any accounts of the rise and fall of civilizations, whether Arnold Toynbee or people more recently, such as Jared Diamond or John Michael Greer or anyone else, you'll know that one of the, as it were, causes of the declines of empire is when they fail to observe that basic principle, and their lust for resources leads them to impoverish whole ecosystems and move to next and move on and move on, and ultimately it becomes unsustainable because it cannot be sustained. It's a historical process. But where I've been really kind of curious about this is looking in particular the 1960s and into the 1970s, and looking at the appearances of the word, the adjective sustainable, and the verb to sustain, and how it seems to shift in the 1960s into the 1970s from being a very, very specific and kind of rather free of value. I don't mean value free, maybe I mean sort of value light. A verb that just sort of refers to something within its specific parameters, into something which is now a very value heavy term, which talks about these tensions between growth, limits, between natural resources and human populations, between ecology, economy, society, global economics, these huge sort of shifting tectonics of geopolitical concern. Prior to the early 1970s, the word sustainable wasn't really used in such a sense. And certainly, obviously, as I'll explain, sustainability didn't appear at all. And I find this quite interesting. And I've been poring over so many books of the 1960s. And it's been a beautiful, eye-opening exercise. And in fact, this is, Rianne, this is like slightly more recent. Some of the books I've been reading more recently, specifically sort of on the hunt for this word, but also at the same time, really getting my head around the rise of ecology, environmentalism, and what we can later call the rise of the language of sustainability. And, in case you're interested, this very, very, very peculiar expression, sustainable development, but we'll come back to that. I can give you an example. Reading a book that really everyone should read, because it's a beautiful book. Strangely enough, it's a book that is it's a sort of book that everyone refers to without necessarily reading, and therefore it's one of those books that we really should read, and that's Silent Spring. I'm just looking around to see if anyone's ever read Silent Spring. It was published in 1962, Rachel Carson. It is a beautiful book. It's a very powerful book, and of course it's an example of a book with a great poetic angle and a sort of poetic aspect to it that really, really did great work. I mean, it did a lot of heavy lifting. It really helped transform policy decisions and policy making. So it's a very powerful sort of paradigmatic text to look at. But she doesn't use the word sustain at all. It just appears on a couple of occasions. Like on one occasion, she talks about prior to the use of DDT, whilst the Green Revolution was sort of unfurling, she says, for example, growers, she's referring to agriculturalists, had to sustain heavy losses. Now, look at that, just the use of the verb sustain. You have to sustain heavy losses. It's just a very sort of concrete expression. And she doesn't use the adjective sustainable at all. And obviously, because the word doesn't yet exist, sustainability doesn't appear. And so, as I've been exploring further, I see a really fascinating, oh man, it's been exciting. When I say exciting, I've driven my family to drink, and my daughter's only 12 years old, so maybe not quite to drink, but because I've been reading like a bastard for basically since we went into this very, very strange, weird time of 2020 onwards. And I've kind of, aside from chopping wood and building things, I've been reading and writing and reading and writing, and it seems to be a process that's not going to end, even though I'm on a book that I should have submitted to the publishers now about a year ago. I'm just carrying on going further forward into this, and I'll explain why in a minute. But what I've been finding is that the growth of this idea around global ecology, as opposed to somebody just looking at their own backyard, like Darwin looking at worms, or like the Reverend Gilbert White looking at his vicarage in Selborne. The rise of looking at global systems interconnected as a great sort of network of ecosystems. Interestingly enough, and I don't know if any of you happen to sort of thought about this, it's intimately connected with the rise of images of the Earth from space. And I find this really fascinating. So what you find in the mid to late 60s is you have a whole production of books and articles and journal articles around the idea of spaceship Earth. Spaceship Earth, what an amazing phenomenon. What a cool question this is. And what this really it first came about with Earthrise. Some of you may be familiar with the original picture of Earthrise. And then later into the 1970s, other images of space, of the Earth from space. But this is intimately connected with the rise of ecological thinking and environmental activism, monkey wrenching, Earth First, all this sort of very, very, very dynamic move around ecology, protection of ecosystems, protection of the redwoods, protection of forests, protection of old growth forests, especially in the States. It's really intimately connected with images of the Earth from space. And I go back to 1966, and there was this extraordinary guy called, what was his name? Balding. And his name was Kenneth Balding. And the first place I ever came across him was that he was cited in the 1972 Club of Rome's Limits to Growth, which is, again, more on this later, a controversial book that's still controversial today. A lot of ink has been spilt over the Club of Rome, and in particular the 1972 book Limits to Growth. But they cite in a footnote, well, there's a reference, and then you can see there's a citation, and then there's a reference in the footnote. Kenneth Balding, an article that he published in 1966 called "The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth." And he writes, and I find this really interesting, he says, "The closed economy of the future," he says, "might simply be called the spaceman." Sorry, I'll go back a little bit. That's my mistake. I was reading too. He talks about economics from two different perspectives, one being cowboy and the other being spaceman. Hey, spaceman. And he says the cowboy economics being symbolic of the illimitable plains and also associated with reckless, exploitative, romantic and violent behavior, which is characteristic of open societies. So what you can see there is he presents economics from a cowboy perspective, and think obviously of the expansion and the settling and the conquest of the West under manifest destiny. Think cowboys and Indians. Think the extirpation of the bison on the Great Plains. Think the idea that there is no limit. There is no limit. You can set up a farmstead or a homestead here, and if you need to expand further, you can just keep expanding, keep expanding. If you remove a forest here, you can remove, don't worry, there's more forest, there's more forest. You can dam a river here because there's more rivers, there's more rivers. That's the way he presents the cowboy economics. Whereas the spaceman economy, as he says, which is to do with a closed economy of the future, and I go back to the bit I was just quoting a second ago, he says, in which the Earth has become a single spaceship without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution, and in which, therefore, man must find his place in a cyclical ecological system, which is capable of continuous reproduction of material form, even though it cannot escape having inputs of energy. Bingo. Look at that. That is such a wonderful, early, without use of word, definition of sustainability. And he's using an idea which I've been exploring in greater and greater depth, the idea of closed and open systems. Now, according to thermodynamics, there is no such thing as a closed system. A totally closed system would be called an isolated system. And the only isolated system that anyone can actually posit is the universe itself. Blah. Well, that's just crazy. So there's not much point thinking about it. There is no such thing as a truly closed system. A closed system, from a thermodynamic principle, means that material, it's closed to material. The materials don't escape the boundaries of the system, but obviously energy does. And obviously the closed system usually is counter-entropic, especially obviously, as we know, a biological system such as the Earth, counter-entropic because it resists the process of entropy and dissipation of energy. It's a really, really interesting idea. If you're not familiar with this idea, it's been blowing my mind, what constitutes a closed system and how we think about closed systems. But of course, where it becomes interesting is these images of the Earth from space. They started to appear more and more, and they gave a very, very clear understanding of the Earth as a closed system. At least, I mean, it's not entirely closed even for material, is it? Because, meteors can come and, things can come through the atmosphere. And similarly, as we know, things can leave the atmosphere, spaceships, for example. But generally, it's a closed system that relies on the recycling of everything. And the only thing it doesn't rely on recycling, obviously, is energy. And that's hence the thermodynamic principle, because we have the source of energy from the sun. So this idea of spaceship Earth, even though it's not presented in the early days of the 1960s as being one of sustainability, because the word doesn't yet exist, it is intimately related to this. And oh man, I could carry on citing lots and lots of other people. There is a British economist called Barbara Ward, and she actually writes a book called Spaceship Earth. And she, this is really interesting, cites Richard Buckminster Fuller. Now, my God, I tell you what, I mean, really, reading is all you need to do, really, just to have your mind blown. This is Buckminster Fuller, and this book is Critical Path, but this is not the book I'm referring to. Buckminster Fuller was just the most amazing guy. And quite, I think I understand why he's been slightly airbrushed from history recently, because he was optimistic, and we don't really deal with optimism now. But Barbara Ward cited Buckminster Fuller in her book, Spaceship Earth. And she, again, I'm just going to just cite one thing very, very quickly. She says, the most rational way of considering the whole human race today is to see it as the ship's crew of a single spaceship on which all of us, with a remarkable combination of security and vulnerability, are making our pilgrimage through infinity. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. So hi guys, crew members, shipmates on our pilgrimage through infinity. I think that's absolutely lovely. But of course, and I won't read the rest of her talk here of the book, but she talks about the fact that we are upsetting that balance, and we're jeopardizing the security and vulnerability on this pilgrimage through infinity. And it's a very powerful text. Interestingly enough, it's not a work of environmentalism, and it's not a work about ecology. It's actually a work of economics. And again, I find this really interesting to see how we have all, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here, we've all been kind of brought up with the idea that economics and ecology are separate things. But of course, they're not, because they both derive from that prefix, oikos, meaning the home. And economics and ecology are absolutely two sides of the same coin. But we forget that, and we kind of we are taught, because we see it in the news, we see the language of politicians and bankers and all these other fuckers. We're taught to think that ecology is ecology and economy is economy, and never the twain shall meet. But it's not the case. And Barbara Ward is very interesting there. And she talks about what it means to be upsetting balance. And in fact, her whole book, all the chapters are named balance. There's balance of power and balance of wealth and balance of ideology. And the whole thing is around balance. Now, of course, what did I do? What do you expect me to do? I get onto my desk, Auntie, and I say balance, and I look up and get the right volume, A to L. Balance. That's a really interesting word. It comes from the Latin bilancia, meaning a pair of scales. And you're probably familiar with the suffix bi, as in, well, it's in hundreds of words, and bis, like biscuit, twice cooked. Bi means two or twice. And lanx means a flat plate or a scale. So bilanx. The Libra Balanx are the scales that represent justice. So balance and justice, weighing and measuring, equilibrium and stability, these are what her book, Barbara Ward's book, are all about. Spaceship Earth relies on balance. Of course, once again, what you can see is these are all the building blocks of sustainability. Now, both Barbara Ward's book and Kenneth Boulding's article appeared before Christmas 1968. What happened then? That is the photograph of the Earth rising over the moon's surface, taken from Apollo 8 at 175,000 miles from the Earth's surface. And it's called Earthrise. Now, I'm not going to bother with sharing screen and all that jazz, but just make a note for yourself. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. Look on Wikipedia for a history of Earthrise, the photograph. It's really, really, really amazing. And I've been reading all sorts of books. One book in particular called Earthrise. I've got my students to read it in one of my modules. The book is all about Earth, the photographs of Earth from space, going all the way back to the Soviet ones in the 1950s, and how important they are in transforming consciousness. I mean, really powerful. And interestingly enough, as the astronauts and the cosmonauts went further into space, so they turned their attention more and more to the Earth. And in fact, Bill Anders, who was one of the astronauts aboard Apollo 8, he says in this lovely quote, he says, "We set out to explore the moon and instead discovered the Earth." And this is repeated throughout history. As we go further and further towards the present, as we come closer and closer towards the present, we see that more and more images of even the James Webb images of today are all set in relation to the Earth. And the Earth from space is a very, very powerful, very powerful image. So where are we at then? We're at the idea that here we're dealing with Spaceship Earth and all these different accounts of Spaceship Earth presenting the basic matrix that becomes the notion of sustainability before the word has actually existed. But it's not all roses, because at the same time you've got to realize that there is this question of balance. Is not all about consumption of resources, and it's not all about economics, and it's not all about the relationship between the so-called developing world and the so-called developed world, or the underdeveloped world. I'll be talking a little bit more about later about development and what that means. But it's got a lot to do, and you can see it already becoming quite a fundamental aspect of this whole discussion. It's got a lot to do with population growth. Now, this is the reason that I don't seem to be anywhere close to finishing my work on this, and I think I will keep exploring this even once the deadline for submission of my manuscript has sailed like 3 or 4 years in the past. And that is because I've also identified this coming together of environmental and ecological narratives with a language that can be quite unsettling, not only around overpopulation, but also around mechanisms for dealing with overpopulation. And there's no better way of looking at that than 1968, the book that still gets people very hot under the collar, and it's called The Population Bomb, and it's by Paul Ehrlich and his wife Anne Ehrlich, and it was published in 1968, Population Bomb. Again, look out for it. It's the most extraordinary book. It's actually quite frightening. The introductory chapter is actually called Too Many People. Too Many People. And it talks about the dangers of catastrophic population growth, saying, and look at the use of the word sustained here, no growth rate can be sustained in the long run. And it continues, at a minimum, it seems safe to say that a population of 1 billion people could be sustained in reasonable comfort for perhaps 1,000 years if resources were husbanded carefully. So note the use of the word sustained there. This is where sustained starts to take on an overtone, which just worth paying attention to, okay? Because we see now what we saw earlier with Kenneth Boulding and Barbara Ward, and I haven't yet mentioned Buckminster Fuller's operating manual for Spaceship Earth, but what you see with the Ehrlichs and then with other texts, and obviously the Club of Rome is important here, the limits to growth, is the idea of balance is not only one of good husbandry of resources, as the Ehrlichs say, and not only one of shrewd economic theory and practice, but it's also to do with establishing balance in population. And indeed, back to the Ehrlichs, they talk about, and quoting, bring population under control and stabilize. And the reason I find this important is it's, I think, really important to emphasize the fact that as we're getting closer and closer to the birth of the word sustainability, so we are introducing a new layer into this language around ecology, land management, and the environment in a sort of broad sense. So we're also introducing a layer into that, which is around overpopulation at a human level and what we can do about it. Now, that's slightly blown out of the water by Buckminster Fuller. I really insist, I urge you all to read Buckminster Fuller. I have this little project which I'd like to do at some stage. I've just made some notes at the moment, and that is to make a sort of a strange comparison between Buckminster Fuller and Swedenborg. Some of you may know that I've been exploring Swedenborg for many years, and I've published books for the Swedenborg Society. And yet, strange enough, I see Buckminster Fuller and Swedenborg as actually quite similar. These kind of cosmic visionaries. Honestly, read Buckminster Fuller. I mean, it's like me saying, go and look at some paintings by Leonardo, or go to the Sistine Chapel, or it really is astonishing. And Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth, which he published in 1969, really stands in stark contrast to the year before to the Ehrlich's population bomb. Because he basically says, no, we can handle the population. The population's fine. We just need to learn better management of our resources. We need to learn how to deal with what we have much better. And he says some wonderful things about Spaceship Earth. And I'm going to read this. I think this is beautiful. He says, I've often heard people say, I wonder what it would like to be on board a spaceship. And the answer is very simple. What does it feel like? That's all we have ever experienced. We are all astronauts. And what I find amazing by that is when I read that, I suddenly remembered an experience I had in 2015. And I remember that year in particular. I had been up to my daughters were very young then, and I'd been up to the mountains in Spain, in Leon, really high, craggy mountains, very cold at night and very hot in the daytime. And I haven't seen such clear skies. It was just unbelievable. The whole of the Milky Way stretched across. And I remember so clearly the sudden understanding that I had, a long time before I'd read Buckminster Fuller, of, holy shit, we're in space. We are in space. Not space is out there, but we are in space. The fact that we traditionally, we conventionally look through the atmosphere looking up, makes us feel that we are not in space and space is out there. You've got to be an astronaut to be in space. But actually, no, we're on a little ball of rock floating through space. And it really, you kind of need to be there to experience that. It doesn't really work when you're walking along a big, a city street with the street lights and the cars and the buses and the rain and the lights of Tesco's. It doesn't really work that way. You need to be up in the mountains or on the ocean. But yes, sorry, I'm digressing. We're all spaceship Earth shipmates. I think that's absolutely wonderful. So where do we go from here? The Ehrlichs published more books about population, and there was more about the need to restore balance and achieve an established equilibrium and achieve sustainable levels. And then I think the next sort of real landmark would be in early 1972. Lots of things happened in 72. 72 seems to be like a threshold. It's like a date that my eyes seem to be drawn. My attention is drawn to 1972. Lots of things happened. First of all, it was the United Nations conference on, what was it called? Sorry, I just skipped in my memory there. It was the first United Nations conference dedicated to the human and the human environment. Humans and the Environment, I think it's called, and it's in Stockholm, and it's in early 1972. And one of the reports that was submitted to that is a book by Barbara Ward, whom I mentioned earlier, in which she outlines, again, very similar, these notions of balance, equilibrium, flexibility, stability, and resilience, set against imbalance, inequalities, rigidity, inequalities, and lack of resilience. And so what's really interesting there is that, again, this is right on the threshold of the birth of the word sustainability. And we can see these words are already kind of coalescing. But also one of the other reports that was submitted to that was nothing less than the limits to growth. So the limits to growth was actually presented to the delegates at the UN conference on human and the environment in Stockholm in 1972. And it's a very interesting one, this. The limits to growth is worth reading, problematic as it is. And the reason it's interesting to read is because it was really heretical at the time. And it was heretical because it presented a particular objective. And that objective, if you think about it, was heretical back then and is still heretical. And that was, exactly as the title of the book itself says, set limits on growth. Growth is something that you cannot possibly set limits on. Growth is growth. As the Lorax, those of you who know the Lorax, as he brilliantly writes, this is a Dr. Seuss books, bigger is bigger. I had to grow bigger. How does he say? He says, so bigger I got. I biggered my factory, I biggered my roads, I biggered my wagons, I biggered the loads. The Onceler, those of you who know the Lorax, knows that you can't stop growth. Growth is imperative. And so what the limits to growth was suggesting, that there should be limits to growth, was absolutely heretical. But obviously it's also, there are two aspects to this which have been the controversial. No, there have been many controversies around the limits to growth. And it's been, oh my goodness, I mean, books and books have been written about the limits to growth, and 20-year updates, 30-year updates, 50-year updates, and so it goes on and on and on. I mean, the limits to growth is a book that it's an ongoing project, the limits to growth. But it was picked up even at that time by people who were critical of the computer modeling that was used. And again, if you start to look at that from the perspective of some modern, more sort of some critics of the modern world, modern world sort of post 2020, you will get sucked down some rabbit holes very quickly. So tread carefully there. But yes, the limits to growth really set this ball rolling of a very difficult set of questions. One, odd computer modeling. Now we're all facing odd computer modeling today. My goodness, aren't we? And these strange algorithms. Secondly, again, as with the Ehrlich's questions about balancing population, and how, the moment anyone suggests that there's a problem with population, you then have to say, well, what are you going to do about it? And the moment anyone suggests something to do about it, you're in very dodgy territory. And Rhiannon, I've returned to Aldous Huxley, and I've found that he's not quite so untarnished by his brother as we might have thought initially. We can maybe talk about that a bit later. But yes, Aldous Huxley, rather like his brother Julian, was quite happy to suggest all sorts of mechanisms for reducing population. It's quite unsettling to read, but we'll come to that a bit later. But thirdly, and this is the other thing, which is, thinking of the Davos crowd and et cetera, is who the hell is talking about limits to growth? This is the important one as well. Who is it who sets the agenda? Who is it who says limits to growth? Is it a small remote community of indigenous people living in the Amazon basin who are saying, you guys, set limits on growth? No. And it is this question which occurs again and again and again and again in every single year, of the people who are setting these agendas of limits to growth are generally the leading bankers, industrialists, politicians. They're people of immense wealth. And again, if you're interested, look at the history of the Club of Rome itself, and you'll see that it's got the Rockefellers, and it's got Antonio Pecci, who was he was the managing director of Fiat in Italy. You've got big, heavy hitting economic forces, and therefore you have that same question that then hits us again and again and again, especially with austerity and especially today, of who is it who's instructing belt tightening, and in what way and who. But this is where I could carry on moving forward from the 1970s. I'm aware of the time, so I'll kind of conclude this bit and we can carry on talking in a conversation. And that is that 1972 is where the first appearance of sustainability, I find anyway. And that was, interestingly enough, in a review of the conference itself. No, it's a review of one of the texts that was produced for the conference. Sorry, my mistake. One of the many texts that was produced for the conference is called Only One Earth. And it's a very beautiful book, actually. It's another really interesting book. It was the one I just mentioned earlier by Barbara Ward, also with René Dubos, another interesting person. And this review in June 1972 in The Ecologist, and The Ecologist is another interesting area to explore as well, is the first place that I've come across the word sustainability. And it is here where now all these different words, and I've done this, sorry, I didn't do it with you guys, but we could have done this, we could do it on another occasion, to ask a group of people, as I've done many times in class and in other groups, what does sustainability mean? Just throw it out there and people write words, and you'll see the sort of words that we've already come across: balance, resilience, flexibility, recycling, resource management, all these words that we've covered. They all appear and they now congress around sustainability. Okay, now I think what I'll do is I'll end there. There's so much more. I mean, again, I should perhaps mention two more things before we do. So sorry if I'm rambling. First of all, the following year is when Ernst Schumacher published Small is Beautiful. Now, some of you may have come across Schumacher before because it's he who gives his name to the Schumacher College down in Dartington near Totnes in Devon. And the Schumacher College is a truly awesome place. It's where Andy Letcher works. Those of you who know Andy Letcher, you may know his work, Shroom from 2005. He'll probably be at Exeter for Breaking Convention. We'll see. He's a regular attendee. He works at Schumacher College. Now, Schumacher is a very interesting one because unlike these other accounts that we've seen, which are more around how to influence policymakers, Schumacher is really speaking to the individual about how to recognize the beauty in small. And again, if you're looking for an amazing text to read, Small is Beautiful, and it's actually the long title is Small is Beautiful, A Study of Economics as If People Mattered, 1973. And where I'll end is the fact that all these texts, all this massive coming and going of reports and policy documents and articles and books and other publications, including The Limits to Growth of 1972, and including Buckminster Fuller's Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, and including Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, and including the Lorax. Let's not forget the Lorax, which is 1972, so it's again related. And if you're not familiar with the Lorax, once we're done today, just go and read the Lorax. It's amazing. Don't watch the film. The film's shite, but it makes it too long-winded. But the book is utterly sublime. They were all followed by that fuel crisis. Now, I was born in 1975. I don't remember it, but I do kind of have memories of the 70s and the difficulties that emerged in the 70s, exacerbated in 1973 with a fuel crisis. Now, why that was interesting was because the fuel crisis was really severe, much more severe than what we had last year and what we're still going through here now. Much more severe. I mean, all the pumps were dry, but people's cars, people couldn't drive. Lovely. but obviously it wasn't lovely as well, because people were very cold and people were suffering. But what that did is that fuel crisis really brought into sharp relief all these questions, especially one around fossil fuels, which is obviously, again, 1970s is kind of the birth of all this language around the impact of fossil fuels on it's at the capacity for the burning of fossil fuels to affect the global climate and global weather patterns. So what I'll do is I'll end at that stage, because this is just the start of a whole new question around sustainable development and what the hell that means. That the fuel crisis in 1973 became therefore a kind of a stirring pot, a big cauldron where all these concepts and all these ideas around resources and around economics and around development and around sustainability really were brought into sharp relief, and it marked a sort of a catalyzing of new global summits and conferences and congresses and reports, especially reports towards policymakers. I think I'll end there. Otherwise, I'll just be droning on and on and on forever. And it's coming up to past. I mean, literally, I've just scratched the surface of where I've been exploring in the last few years around this, and all of which is very, 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 and I can't emphasize enough, very relevant to where we are today. When we're looking at the move from the military-industrial complex to the medical industrial complex, when we're moving ever more towards some of these ideas of global governance that has been promoted and warned about for so long, when we're seeing the use of the word sustainability to justify all sorts of rather horrendous plans and projects and greenwashing. The reason I'm finding this really interesting is I'm kind of going back to sort of to base camp. I'm going back to the sort of the substrate upon which it's all based, and in particular looking at the actual genesis of the word, the actual moment that the word sustainability first sprung into existence, gives me, and hopefully me sharing some of these ideas with you, gives you guys a little bit of a handle on trying to sort of understand some of the strange global tectonics of where we are today. So let me end there, and let's then chinwag. There you go.